Welcome to 502 Co-Designing the Future. My name is Katina Michael. I'm the program chair of the new Masters of Science in Public Interest Technology. And today I've got this massive smile on my face because we've got Theresa Anderson with us. Welcome, Theresa.
Thank you for having me. I can't tell you how much I've been looking forward to a chance to just have this chat with you and with 502. I even started a whole folder with all these ideas and said, oh, this would be great to talk about, and this would be great. So thank you for asking me. And
well,
hi, everyone.
It was a conversation we had in this room probably about a month ago, where you said to me, my experience tells me, Kat, that you should have external mentors, not just academic mentors. That sounds like a good idea, but first of all, because we spent the last 2 minutes laughing before I pressed the record button. But first of all, let's get serious.
Okay.
Yeah, get serious, Theresa. Tell us about yourself.
I knew you were going to ask me, and I thought, how do my description changes from day to day. And we spoke just before this about my capacity to morph and to shapeshift. And that is both a strength and a weakness, because it does mean that my elevator pitch is really bad. But it also means that I try to respond to the moment in time. So at the moment, I am feeling very much like a socio-technical historian, which is a consequence of my training. I've gone through the whole spectrum of degrees, and just thinking in terms of your class. So it's still so awkward not seeing them there to sort of look at age and experience. But if I imagine a class back when I was an undergraduate, and I think about my early 20s, when I thought I have to figure out what I'm going to do, and I have to, I had a very clear idea. At that stage, I was preparing for the diplomatic service, and I was a Sovietologist. So I was working in the Cold War. And I can remember going to talk to people in the field. I was very fortunate that I was directed towards them. And I think that also modeled for me what to do, to never be afraid to talk to a young person about what they want to do. And I still remember sitting in the office of a person who I ended up doing some interning for down in Washington, D.C., and he just looked at me. I think I was all of 22 at the time. And he just looked at me, he said, Theresa, by the time you reach my age, and he was 40-ish at the time, he said, I would be surprised if you didn't have at least 4 careers. He said, that is how things are going. So this was many decades ago, so I won't go into during the Cold War. And that was a radical thing for someone to say at that stage. But it was just the thing to say to me. So
I've got so many questions. Did you learn Russian by any chance?
No, конечно. So yeah, so that was the very first job I had when I was still at university, and I was studying Russian, because this was just at the point where the Soviet army was starting to move into Afghanistan. And I worked for the Middle East Research Institute that was associated with the university. I was at University of Pennsylvania as an undergrad, and I was doing Soviet studies, diplomatic history as my double major. That was after having decided that I couldn't do physics and Soviet studies together. So when I first started, what I wanted to be was an atmospheric physicist working in the Soviet Union with the Soviet Union to build bridges, because the physics and the science there was so much more advanced in that space. And in order to do that, I had to study Russian. And because my background, so my family come from the Iron Curtain, quite literally, the farms of my father's family so my heart starts to race when I talk about this. So it became the border between East and West. So overnight, you suddenly have a creek behind your farm. That is where you go and you jump across the creek to get what you need from across the creek. And then suddenly it's a no man's land or a no woman's land. And I have images as a child being taken to these towers that were built by the communities that had been displaced as a 25-kilometer no man's land was created in that space. And they built these towers so that we could go up there, and they would take their children, like me, up there to look at the land that was theirs, and that would never be theirs again. it now, so talking about how life has a way, that area that was cleared for no reason other than to make sure that the community could not stay alive, and that a group, the arbitrariness of a group of people being moved further east and another group of people being moved further west, how topography shaped that, because this is very mountainous region. This is a very, 1,500 meters high, very rugged, and my family's history goes back hundreds of years there. And when someone says, well, what are you? It's like, okay, well, what year are we thinking about who was born when? So, I have Bohemian roots, I have Bavarian roots, I have Austrian roots. And there is a place where those three kingdoms met. And that is literally my family's backyard. After the Cold War ended, so not intentional. So that theme of unintentionality is a really big one as well. That ended up being what is now marketed as the rooftop of Europe. It has turned out to be some of the last pristine forest left in Central Europe, because when you clear everyone out, there's a lot of decay. There's a lot of, I've been back a number of times now that it's possible, to see the remnants of villages and houses and things. Some parts were flooded to create a big, what do you call it in English?
A dam or
dam, water reservoir, and the like. Again, merely just to destroy the homes. And then that became a reservoir to use for hydroelectricity, but that was not the intention. The intention was to wipe out. But the area around it is gorgeous, absolutely marvelous. And I just love being up there and remembering times past. But because of having that in my background, for me, it was as a child, seeing displacement, and this is a story of diaspora that lots of children of people who have been pushed out of their homes have, where you have this connection to a place that does exist in the imaginary, but no longer exists in real life and will constantly change. And so many parts of the world are political footballs where people are pawns in a game that they have no control over. And because it was East-West, and because of the variations in language in my family growing up, it just seemed natural that I would have to learn Russian. Not because my family spoke Russian. That was, there are parts where you do not use German. They'd rather use any language other than Russian. But realizing that perhaps the gift that I had was this boundary spanning history, that's what pushed me into physics. And it was going to be, now I think it's called science diplomacy. At the time, that wasn't language, but that was really what I wanted. I wanted to be able to have these languages, have these cultural experiences. But there I sat in the university, and I was spending hours a day studying Russian and speaking it and brushing my teeth and listening to Tchaikovsky and making sure I got the whole mood right. I wasn't doing my physics homework. So I had to make a choice at one point, and then an elective, which was diplomatic history, became my second, and that then led to work as a diplomat, the Sovietologist, reading so it was Sovietology and then diplomacy and then arms control. Or was it, no, Sovietology, arms control, then diplomacy. Sorry.
I think that's remarkable, and thank you for sharing the depth of that story. And I mean, technology and borders must be something you think about very often. I know when we were building network plans, and there were the Kashmir region, for example, we would get a GIS map in the mid-90s and open up the map and start layering on top, and there were certain sections you just wouldn't show the customer because it was controversial for both sides. Like you can't win as a third party looking in, but also it was the first time I had come head to head with the power of borders, the power of I understood it in the past, but not really. And you lived it through your family. I saw it through the eyes of my father-in-law, my late father-in-law, who was Cypriot, and North and South and occupation. And then my father, who grew up, he was a little boy during World War II, where the town was invaded several times and burnt to the crisp, and then they returned post the war to rebuild from nothing and to figure out, how do I put stones on top of each other? How do we make, stones to make a house, to have shelter?
Yes. Yeah.
With your area of expertise, I mean, I didn't even know when, we had talked several times at least, and then I had invited you to come and talk on data science at a recent workshop, the 14th workshop on the social implications of national security. And then it dawned on me when you provided it and presented an abstract that did talk about this research, the Cold War, that you actually had this background, but you had never really used it as the way that we had met.
Exactly.
Was amazed. Yeah. So tell us about the other degrees. Tell us about the other interests, and when did they happen?
So on that aspect, I think we're soul sisters. So I think that's why, these things will come out. This is, and it is, and I love too, I think that the natural unfolding and the peeling away of layers, to me, that is what it means to just be human and to make time to engage. And it also shows you can never, what's the old adage, you can't judge a book by its cover, but you need covers to try to help you to understand, well, how do we move forward? And it's about making time to read inside that, if I can play with that metaphor. And that actually transitions into the other roles I had. So I was in the diplomatic service. And again, I joined because I felt I had lived a life that demonstrated how to build bridges and to make understandings. And that just felt like my calling. And, if I have remained anything through all of that, when I was in science or when I was doing analysis, that sense of appreciating the life of the other has always been there. That is still very much a part of me. So I was in the diplomatic service, and it became really hard to be me in the service. And this is not an uncommon situation in those kinds of situations, those kinds of roles where you are meant to be both a specialist and a generalist. And, on the one hand, you are yourself and you are professional, but then you're also representing something other than yourself. And it just so happened that the post that I had, I was based as a junior. So I was training because my undergraduate specialty was Soviet Central Asia and Ottoman empires. And wow. I was primed. I had done my internship at the Israeli desk at the State Department.
Incredible.
And it was a given I was going to the Middle East. And then I was preparing for my post, and at the last minute in my class, they had an opening. They needed someone urgently to take a post in Switzerland. And ideally, because they didn't have time to train them in languages, they needed someone who spoke at least one of the Swiss languages. And I had happened to be an exchange student in Switzerland when I was a kid. And so I had Swiss German, I had German, I had French, and I understood the culture. And so it was kind of a no-brainer. And I remember being so disappointed. I was going to Europe, it was like,
the Middle East.
Sorry, I was ready. So my post was supposed to be Mozambique. And I remember it was a hardship post, but I got, the plan was I would get less percentage of the hardship pay because I had an avocado tree in my back garden. And I just remember thinking, wow. Okay, how is someone calculating this? Where's the someone that works out? No, there's risk, but she's got avocados. It's like,
have you seen that Mr. Bean movie? Whenever someone says Mozambique, the eyebrows go. I can't do it. I know some people who can, but I'll try it. Theresa Anderson, I can't do it.
Yes, was it really?
And +1 for the avocado tree. All right, okay, let's get serious. That is unbelievable. What a story.
And I apologize to your class for digressing on this.
No,
but it was that it's how the accidents of the present shape our future and call on our past. And again, that is very much a part of the ongoing narrative that I have. I see myself as a very reflective person and thoughtful. I love and I engage in uncertainty. So I think how we met, my PhD was in uncertainty and relevance, and I brought together information science and the anthropology of uncertainty. And again,
Wow.
that was like, well, this is my life. So of course, let's just study it and get a PhD in it. So at that time when I was in the diplomatic service and I was in Switzerland and I was ending up on a path that I hadn't intended, because I was never going to go back. Not that I was going to go back to Europe as a woman of leisure, but I was intending to work in the diplomatic service someplace else, end up there. And then because of my languages, I ended up being the liaison for a lot of the community groups. I ended up handling Iranian affairs because the US embassy had no embassy in Iran at the time. And there were lots of people coming through our embassy in Switzerland who were looking for assistance or support or needed to do some sort of formalities with an embassy. And so we had a Swiss interest section in the, that goes off on a whole nother tangent. But what this did was bring me back face to face with refugees. And I had such a hard time on a daily basis. I still, and I'm looking away only because I still see the faces of some of the people I dealt with. And
from Iran, it was from Iran? From Iran? Sorry to interrupt. From Iran,
from Iran. And then also I ended up dealing with refugees from the East. And then once it became known that there was a Russian-speaking American, other interesting things started happening to me in Switzerland. So let's just say Jean Le Carré, and we'll leave it at that. But it made it really hard to not be drawn back into my past and my family history. And I had a hard time not wanting. I really wanted to change the way U.S. policy was being handled, and I was very strong in the way that I was wording what I thought needed to change. But I'm in my 20s, and you're supposed to bide your time, and you're supposed to articulate the directives that come from Washington. And so I kept getting accused of being native. It's like, well, I thought diplomats were about trying to understand and build bridges. So I got to a stage where I realized this is going to be difficult. I was preparing for my next post, which was taking me down to Turkey. But by that stage, I had also met my husband, who bless him, had agreed to follow me and let me carry on with my plans. But
that's exceptional. I'm very happy. I have a husband like that too.
We're
very blessed. So we should.
And so, yes.
Yes.
But, and this comes to this part of the story, the structures at the time made that difficult. So he's an engineer, and he was not American, and I was not a man. And this became problematic because only a few years before I had joined the service, there was a general rule in the US diplomatic service, similar to other parts of the world, where you could not be a woman who married and maintained your role. Men married all the time, and there were male. The culture was just not set for that. So they were advanced to the point where I didn't have to resign when I married, but they had no way of dealing with a non-female dependent coming into would have been a secure position. And he is an engineer who's not American, and they were like, oh, I'm sorry, he can't work, and he could join. So they said, well, he could join the women's circle. They've got a really lovely women's group at the embassy. I was like, so they just made it too difficult. And because of all those obstacles put in place, I thought, well, this isn't, and because I'd been having that difficulty philosophically at wrestling with, it just felt like I had to listen to the forces pushing me into another path. So it took a while. We ultimately, as it happened too coincidentally, he had just signed on to migrate to Australia as I had signed on to my post. And so we ended up taking a few years to find countries that would set us both. Luckily, I knew quite a lot about visa law, so we could work out. Ended up in Australia, and here I am. By this stage, the Cold War is in its dying stages, and I had a point. I thought, I'll go back and do a PhD, and I had some ideas about ways I was going to work in that policy space. And every time I came up with an idea, something I was trying to work on, the problem would move on. So Yeah, and this became a running gag for a while. So I was looking at, this was well before it was a possibility, I had been looking at the possibilities of East-West German reunification. So this was when I was still a diplomat and was going to go back. And then they had the audacity to unite without letting me finish writing up. That gets
they were reading your posts.
They were reading my posts. So
then
I thought, oh yeah, because some of the framework that I was looking at, and I'll come back to this. Sorry for rambling on about.
No, you're not rambling. This is just, for those listening, this is a perfect way to learn. And I'm learning like a rapid fire at the moment. Just keep talking, Theresa.
And this is stories. So, and this is actually one of the things I think is really important in terms of some of the conversations we had in the lead up to this interview about how you bring people on board, the power of storytelling. And again, I feel very connected to my past because there is a tradition of storytelling, oral storytelling in my family. And as a child, I can remember being taken to see the people who still had the memories and they had the artifacts of that life from a land that no longer existed and acting them out. And that just, oh my God, that was just magical. And possibly that is what has connected in my mind and tied me to a land, to a point where, and I've spoken with Australian Indigenous about this as well, because I get the notion of connection to country. So I now am able to go back to that land. And every time I'm back there, I am a different person. I feel a difference. I feel a power and a courage that I have no place else on this planet. And I wasn't born there, but my people are from there. So, in dialect, we'd say Manilai. And that sense of that's my country. I get that notion. And there is something very primordial about appreciating that and staying in that space and allowing that moment and that ecology and the spirits of all those ancestors and a beautiful country as well. So I'm quite biased. So anyway, so I guess that always floats around in my head. So that sense of storytelling is really important. So just sorry to fast forward again. So East-West Germany was no longer a problem to be solved. That's all right. The framework I use is Wallersteinian nation-state politics. So very much looking at different ways that he was looking at political ideas and how cores and peripheries shape. I sort of refer to that in the talk at SINS, where you're more likely at the periphery of a nation state to see divergence than you are at the core. And again, in reflecting on my family history and reflecting on the politics of Europe, I could see that playing out in what was Yugoslavia. I could see that playing out in what was the Austrian Habsburg Empire. I could see that playing out in the Soviet Union because of the work I had done on Soviet Central Asia and the issues in Afghanistan. And so I started to hypothesize about the disruptions that would lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you know what happens. They go ahead and do it without me being able to finish that paper. So, okay, great, good. And it's not because I'm a fortune teller. It kind of tells you that that's what was, there was something that was happening. And so by this time now we're in Australia and no one needs an out of work cold warrior who speaks Russian. Great coffee conversation on the beaches of Bondi because there's a lot of expat Russians down there.
Yes.
But, I was jobless and I was in a new country and I loved this and I had an opportunity to do what I wanted now. And I started to think about, I was doing work in environmental education. So I was working at an environment center and community engagement. And I thought, well, hey, climate crisis, the environment, there are huge issues in the Asia Pacific. So why not take some of those frameworks and start to put that together for a PhD? And I came very close to doing it at UNSW and then realized that there was no future for this, future for me, because the only place where it was looking like I could have gone with the kind of specialty I was doing was overseas. And the whole point was to become a part of this new country. And so in the process of trying to think, well, what would I do? What could I study that would be of value to Australia? I went back to the work I had done before I was a diplomat, which was on arms, because that issues in the Asia Pacific around that might happen. And I was trying to use libraries. I wasn't part of a university, so I was in the State Library of New South Wales, and I was trying to search on these newfangled computers, so this is a while ago again. And I was having real trouble because the language that I use, the terminology, is used differently in Australia because the context is different. And you might laugh at this, but I thought, oh, I know what'll help me to be able to do better searching. I'll do a degree and become a librarian.
So this is the third degree?
This is 1, 2, 3. So 2 undergrads, 1 master's. This is the second master's. So
4
by that stage. Yeah.
So hang on a second. Let me go back. The bachelor's was, we said, in Sovietology. We've lost you for a second.
Okay.
So the first degree was in...
so Soviet studies, and then I took time off and I did German languages and literature. So I studied in Germany for a while.
Wow.
Back, but so that was just I ended up being over in Germany during the rise of the Green Party, and so that was really extraordinary to be able to witness that. And again, staying in a border town, so this is a running gag with me. Not running gag. That sounds disrespectful, but I lived right on the border of Germany and Switzerland, and so the question that I took into the degree, and that's what took me to UTS as an
library science.
Library science. So at that point, UTS was doing something very radical. They weren't calling it library science. They were calling it information studies. And I like that. It was this alternative notion. It wasn't about structure. It was about disrupting structure. It was about trying to understand how people make sense and how they use information. And one possible pathway was librarianship. And I thought, okay, I'll become a research librarian, got all this understanding. And if I can work out how to help someone do better research, then that would be a lovely path. But the very question I took into that degree became the question of my thesis, which was, how do you find what you're looking for? And when do you know when you found it? Which is the fundamental, as it turns out, it's the fundamental question of information science, which is relevance and the concept of uncertainty. And so the whole reason for telling that whole long story is that's when being a Sovietologist came back into play. Because what I realized is, and it's why I'm a socio-technical historian and a social informaticist as well, because what I realized when I was putting together the PhD topic after the master's, and again, I wasn't going to do a PhD. I finished the degree. I had my master's. I was doing my last seminar, raising some of the very questions that ended up being my thesis. But I had a gig. I was ready to go into the EPA because I had done a lot of work on community engagement and different ways of helping small businesses, small manufacturing firms specifically, to fulfill a need with environmental compliance that they weren't able to do because they were being pushed down by the EPA to be told to regulate, but they weren't given the tools to be able to know how to do that. And small companies don't have compliance officers, and they don't have the funding. When you have less than 100 employees, you're not going to have some special. So the moral of the story is never say never, of course.
That's very true.
Down, after the last...
I've lost you there for a second.
Walking down the street in Sydney, Chinatown. Oh, sorry.
In Ultimo, right?
So taking my library books back after the last... In Ultimo, exactly. That's Paddy's Market right there. So I'm walking, and I'm on that street. I'm seeing the street. So you picture me. And I, two of my friends, side by side, we finished the degree together. None of us were going to do PhDs.
Right.
Fast forward, all three of us. But I so insistently said, oh, well, that's the last time I'm going to do any study. I'm through with, I thought I had it all out of my system, dropped my library books off, took a little break. And then about a month later, the head of that seminar rang me and she said, I really like your seminar paper. Have you thought about a PhD?
Wow.
I think I've lost you.
No, I've got your back. I can hear you.
And so
Theresa,
yeah.
do you want to go back to that? Theresa, do you want to go back to the point, if you can hear me, where you said you dropped off your library books and the seminar supervisor said, I really liked your paper?
So again, I apologize for this paper that ended up being the proposal, had to do with taking the framework.
I think I've lost you, Theresa. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Perfect. Can we go back to the story, and I'll edit out this cut here, where you dropped off your library books at the library at the Haymarket?
Okay, yes, sorry about that. Yeah, so I dropped off the library books. The professor who ran that seminar had called me and said she really liked it and had I thought about doing a PhD. So on what I wrote in that seminar paper and got accepted and got an APA to fund it, which was a really nice bonus. Trying to understand what I saw as a block, conflict between the way that information retrieval systems framed the search and framed relevance and the way we poor humans dealt with it. And understand how it was that it had taken all this time for the systems to not understand that. And so suddenly human system engagements were the new Cold War. Suddenly.
Okay.
Fine.
Wonderful. Okay. So
are you fine with that? Yes.
Very beautiful. So, Theresa, what happened when you dropped off what you thought your books for the very last time in that famous UTS library that I know very well at Haymarket?
Yep. Yes. Yeah. So, and you can picture all the construction outside because it was all the work.
Always.
This was before the Olympics, so there, everything's just in chaos. And the three of us are walking down. The three of us had just finished the seminar series, and I so vividly remember being on the street, Key Street, just saying, "That's it. This is the last time that I'm going to be an academic." Not that I didn't like it, but at that point, I just felt like it really made more sense to do. It made sense to be out in the world, and I was looking forward to working with the EPA and doing things in community engagement and educating. That just was a very clear path. And you drop off the books, you go home, you wait for your results to come back.
Yes.
And a month later, the professor who ran the seminar calls me and says, "That's a really good paper. Have you thought about a PhD?" I was like, that was the Al Pacino quote in Godfather comes up. It's like just when I thought I was free, they pull me back in. So it's and I haven't looked back since then. So because I've been able to find a way to I think navigate both. So I wrote up a proposal, and the professor who ran that seminar ended up becoming my PhD supervisor, as well as one of my other instructors, and all these consequential things happened that shaped the relationship I had with them, because one of them ended up moving to the States. Oh, I think you've frozen again. I'm not sure.
No, I can hear you.
And my main professor became the head of the graduate school, and so there were all these issues that were coming up where other students would say, "Oh, you've got it easy because your professor, your PhD supervisor is the head of the graduate school. You don't have to go through any of the compliance rules and any other." And I was like, "No, it's quite the opposite.
It's worse,
quite
yes.
the opposite. It's worse because she knows that it has to be very above board." So I had so much scrutiny on everything that I did.
Yes.
And every step along the way, the ethics work, which is fabulous because I love that. It was the way to be constantly made to explain the value of what I was doing. And that is what I say, all along, that should be the modus operandi. You shouldn't be able to get away with saying, I want to do something just because. There should be a value, particularly because the work I do is ethnographic. And so I ended up doing what was at the time the very first PhD in taking an ethnographic approach to an information science and information retrieval challenge.
Wow.
And
so like three areas,
I did it
right?
because it was, well, you're talking about people using networked systems. Go figure, people don't act like machines. But that, as you know, that kind of thinking, when you're working with people who are in a tech space, and information retrieval at that stage was very, very profoundly based on an IT notion of communication. And Shannon and Weaver. And that works to a space. But I feel like this was really when being transdisciplinary, a professor once said, being transdisciplinary is in my DNA. You can't come from the kind of family background and having those different degrees and disciplines, because the very topic, the way I tackled the challenge, connected me back to being a Sovietologist and having worked in the Cold War, because suddenly searchers and systems were the two sides of the Cold War. You had
searchers and systems, right? And in a Cold War context, and also sort of alliances and enemies, and this
absolutely.
thing happening here.
Misunderstandings, miscommunications, channels, agreements, arrangements, treaties, and black boxes. So that's where the penny dropped for me. So I was like, hey, I know all about, not that I know what's in the black box, but the very
Theresa
first
Anderson.
job I had in the Soviet, not in the Soviet Union.
I understand.
The very first job I had was to try to understand what was happening in the black box of Moscow and in the black box of the Soviet Union. And so there are black boxes all over the place. They're not solely the domain of technology.
Theresa, is that what you refer to it? Is that what's in the literature, this notion of a black box? When you were studying and when you were investigating things, you would use that terminology in your domain, black box?
Yeah. So the black box, and specifically, because the two core concepts that I dealt with in information retrieval and information science are relevance and uncertainty.
Relevance and uncertainty, and that was your PhD, we said.
That's right, and they are calculated in information retrieval terms, using formulas, using math, to try to interpret what they refer to as the black box. And in fact, the very first information science conference in the 1950s, where they sought to language this, specifically refers to relevance as the black box and uncertainty as the ghost in the machine. And again, it's that unknown, it's what is behind, it's what's invisible. And because they were in a tech domain, that's actually where the idea for my thesis came about too, because these debates happening in the early 50s are the very moment when the Cold War is dawning, and people are trying to understand another form of black box that was technological. You're talking about nuclear weapons, but you're also talking about people who have their fingers on buttons that lead to that. And so trying to think, well, how do you help two different worlds? Because also by the time I was working in information science and librarianship, it was very clear that humans, that searchers trying to use these tools they weren't having their needs met. And there were communities that were disengaged. And again, I'm very proud to have been a part of a librarian movement, and I've trained librarians. There is a really strong sense of advocacy, a commitment to community that comes out of that domain as well. Librarians in the United States in the early days, after the shock of 9/11, when the Patriot Act came about and when there were arguments about what needs to happen in the name of national security, it was librarians who stood up and said, hang on, the libraries have to be safe spaces to provide access to information for people. And it's not that we're trying to create hiding spaces for acts of terror, but you cannot assume that everything that happens in, you know, in an engagement with a machine warrants scrutiny by someone other than that searcher. So that sense of building trust, again, an ongoing term that I use a lot, because I do quite a lot of work in trust building and building community trust now in terms of AI and data. And so I see a lot of that going back to those traditions of librarianship, information mediation, and there's also a lot of misunderstandings on both sides as well.
I have so many questions. Like, we heard that perfectly, by the way, just so you know. I have so many questions. I mean, so your approach, let's just say for the example that you noted with the Patriot Act, it wasn't so much on the side of privacy. You just wanted to do good library science, like you just wanted to do good socio-technical design. What motivated you to think, like the other librarians in the States, look, the Patriot Act has gone too far, it's collecting records of who's borrowing what? What was it? Because then you did stuff with the Environmental Protection Agency, climate change. Like, is there a common thread, or it's all disparate and you just wanted to do good library science? What was it at that point?
It wasn't even about doing good library science, it's about doing good for the community. So there's an underlying, and I think this connects to the topics around public interest technology. It is that sense of beneficence, and it's thinking about speaking for those who don't have a voice at the table. And again, librarianship, and there's some books from the 70s that my professors, when I was training in librarianship, wrote that I still hold on to, even though, you know, this is pre-computational. Because they speak about work that they did, some of the early work in the United States that was done in librarians and trying to help communities had and also because of the lives that they lead, they didn't have the leisure of being able to go to a public library. So there were groups that were creating information centers and ways of taking information. I used to love the idea of the mobile library, and, you know, the different ways of just helping, you know, and it isn't just about books. It's about helping someone to find a way to have access to knowledge outside themselves, and to also be, and this is again the act of the librarian, and it comes back to the searcher system tension. So librarians work very hard to train in reference interviews. So you work off of an assumption that when someone comes to ask me a question, they're not asking me the question they want answered. They're asking the question that they can ask. And there's a whole process of languaging and dialoguing that you're trained in, and that I used to train my students in, so that you try to help someone to engage in a discourse with you, so that you get to what it is that they want. And, you know, and then that opens up a whole Pandora's box about want as opposed to need, you know, and access. But it's very much about trying towards what you have and building a relationship so that you can actually provide a service. So librarianship and information advocacy is a service. It's in a service industry, and it's very much, and you build that up by serving as an intermediary. So intermediation is another very big part of, I think, that mindset, which takes me back personally to diplomacy. So it's trying to see both sides. It's trying to be the person, or the boundary object, or the boundary subject, that allows with your special position to find a way to help two sides or two communities or two different entities find a way to coexist, and find a way, you know, to do more than just coexist. You're trying to make better. And you know, again, I suppose just because of the school that I was in, learning about, you know, information systems at a time when I thought I was going to be a research librarian, it was about, oh, how do I help clients? How do I how do I serve? So, and it's what I take in. So, after I left, not that you leave, but when I stopped teaching and researching specifically just in information science and moved into social informatics and ultimately data science, that notion of service and community and recognizing, a role a translational role that you have when you're in those spaces, dealing with both people and technology. That is very much at the core of a mantra for my own practice, but also the practice I seek to develop in the work that I do with others and with machines, trying to help machines translate as well. So, recognizing there are some things I'd much rather have a machine do than a human, and there are other things I'd much rather have a human do than a machine. So,
Yes.
so I guess that's my new Cold War. It's fighting that.
I'm thinking at the moment, we've run co-designing as an approach. We've run participatory design as an approach, and you're talking to us about community. And I think there's a strong link here between this, of course, as you describe yourself, the socio-technical historian, you describe yourself as an ethnographer, you noted anthropology, languages, culture, obviously that a kind of exposure, this notion of relevance, this notion of uncertainty, this notion of stakeholders. It's almost, and your experience and exposure with climate change and the Environmental Protection Agency and consumer groups and community groups. It's almost as if your path through these winding roads towards data science, it was so organic and natural, and that you perhaps didn't realize when you were working for community groups in Australia, but you were likely spearheading and demonstrating a lot of the best principles and best practice of engagement and empowerment of stakeholders. Tell me when the penny dropped that you were actually doing perhaps what's called co-design or consultation or cooperation in the field, or when did that realization happen to you? My God, I've been doing this for the last 10 years,
Yeah. So I think it already started when I was doing my PhD, because I didn't have, because what I was doing it on did not fit in any one category. Why should it? I was, and UTS.
Yes, a graduate from UTS.
Structure is a hard thing. At any university, structure is a hard thing. But at that particular point, categorization, I was so fortunate to have amazing supervisors who, in the first month said, hey, you are becoming the expert in this domain. We're not going to push you down a certain path. We want to partner you on this. We want to help manage this apprenticeship. So that language of master and apprentice, or mistress and apprentice, was very much a part of my training as a PhD student.
Fabulous.
And they helped me to find the ways to find the people that would help me. So recognizing the limits of their own knowledge, and how blessed was I then to have that as a model. I ache now when I think about students that I know who are not in that model.
Yes.
Where
me too.
They keep coming, to people like you and me and saying, "Can you help me? Because I need the courage to be able to do it." So I actually, for 10 years, I ran the International Doctoral Workshop in Information Seeking for that very reason, because I knew that there were students all over the planet in this domain who were cutting across areas, and they were in faculties where, just because of the way structure works. So this goes back to the infrastructure you were talking about in your experience, from a family perspective, in terms of the Kashmir. It reminded me when I was a child, going back to see what was left of the family areas, because we were on the west side of the Iron Curtain. Train lines stopped, so you saw where the old train lines went. Phone lines only went to a certain point, because phone lines don't connect when there's no place to connect. And so whether you know, the humans, so my family history,
Yeah.
look, we know how to walk. We used to climb across, and I'll just give the little side note. I used to find ways as a child to cross the Iron Curtain. I got very good at finding the places where there were no guards, where there was no barbed wire, because
That's
mushrooms and
incredible.
berries always taste more fantastic on the other side, because that's a forbidden fruit. But I could also do that because, unlike my cousins who had German passports, I carried a US passport. And I knew that if I were to get caught, that there would be a very different way that I, as a human, would be dealt than they. So you reflect on how structure shapes what you are. Structure does not it doesn't you, but and so yeah, you can break that, but you also need to feel empowered and to be able to do that. So fast forward. So I'm at UTS trying to do a PhD in an area that doesn't exist. I'm blessed with this great supervision. We'll have to meet certain parameters in terms of what it is that I have to do. But where do I go? You know, there is no study group because no one's doing this topic. And there was, at that point, there were only 2 of us doing PhDs, and the other was a very traditional one. So, you know, that was okay. But I ended up finding friends over in engineering and IT. You know, I worked in computer services because I'm looking at searchers and systems. You can't be in a space. I was in a humanities faculty, and they used to talk about me going to the dark side, you know, because I'm going over to the IT lab. It's like, you know, sorry, it's
how
you know, maybe
fascinating.
So I ended up becoming unofficially a part of the lab of a professor. She was an associate professor at the time over in the human-centered design lab that was growing up in FEIT.
Who did you know
Tony Robertson?
No, she
Was
never
she
taught
there
me.
when you? I think it was
No.
after.
I finished there in 97,
Okay.
96, forgive me.
So she was fighting her own
battles.
Yeah, that's right. So because I started my PhD, and so she was fighting all these battles, and so in a way, bringing us together helped her to be able to make the case that, you know, yes, see, we're not in human centered doesn't fit in a computer lab, she came from an artist background.
Wow.
And so she was an artist doing participatory design, and one of her mates was Lucy Suchman. So I had master classes with Lucy Suchman as I was doing my PhD, and
tell us about
Lucy.
Tell us about Lucy.
Awesome.
Come on,
you know?
tell us about Lucy.
Jeanette Blumberg. I mean, just such a marvelous human. So thoughtful. So Tony put together. This was actually so I'd been reading Lucy, and I had been part of some overseas events because I was part of IEEE Interact sessions.
I remember. I know the conference. I've downloaded proceedings and referenced them. Right, Interact is famous.
Yeah. So so on that note, just to fast track. So the very first presentation I gave at an Interact conference, I will never forget this. So you know, I've had a whole 2 years in my PhD, and I started to collect the ethnographic work. I was following the lives of 2 searchers as they were 2 different scholars using information via network systems that were just being introduced on campus. And I was coming up with a way. I realized in my first session in the formal usability lab, I realized I can't stay in the usability lab. I have to go where these people are. They were very kind to come and sit in the lab with me. And at that point, there were no such things as mobile usability labs. So I had to come up with this way of, basically I had a triage. I had my digital recorder. And before I had the digital, I still had the cassette. So there's all these tapes I have.
Me too.
All these tapes where you hear them going, is this on? Is this playing? But I was, I was at the ready. So I basically made myself a fly on the wall wherever possible. And again, this is where I worship my PhD supervisors who let me talk to them about what I found in that first fieldwork session and what I wanted to do. And I hadn't thought about that till now, but the formalized, because I was trying to follow Jakob Nielsen's usability model.
Yes.
a good thing. I had a pre-interview, and then I took
Yes.
them into the lab, and then we were going to have the post. And the pre-interview, I had it initially scheduled for 30 minutes, and with my first informant, it was 3 hours. So there's a theme with me, isn't there?
I maybe I'm looking forward to the next hour and a half.
But
I could spend days with
initially
you,
I
Theresa Anderson. Days. That's how.
okay,
That's how excited I am to hear you speak.
The formula with. Oh, but it's that sense of uncovering and getting to know, and also being responsive. So so at that point, it didn't have the name co-design. But what I recognized, because the tradition I came from, the framework I was using as someone trying to engage in an ethnographic practice, was one of naturalism. So at the time, the core text that was brought into information science and education domains was Guba and Lincoln, and the idea of qualitative research. So trying to understand what it meant to be qualitative. And that then took me into the areas of work by people like Norman Denzin, who talks about performative inquiry and narrative and interpretism. And I went all the way back. Again, I couldn't help myself. I went back to the 1930s and the origins of the Chicago School of Sociology and symbolic interactionism and the different ways that language comes up. And that's where brilliant supervision helped, because there was a stage, I had 3 methodology chapters, and my supervisor said, Theresa, it's time to put your toe in the water. You know, you have to, I mean, I do not regret any of that, because I still draw on that. And just as we're talking bloomer, I'm, oh yeah, okay, there's that other aspect. So that richness, that is so important. And I was very privileged. I worry that that isn't possible nowadays, but I was so privileged to be able to have 6 months to just read. And again, because there was no community around me, you know, at that point, my supervisor didn't know enough to know to connect me with Tony. So for the first 6 months, I was my own reading group. And when you have no one else around you, you know, and I'm a good librarian, I know how to search. So I was finding literature and uncovering, and it was just delightful.
And making linkages, right? Making linkages.
Absolutely, that's right. Making
that,
linkages and having the time. So that's a very big part. One of the big mantras I use in the classroom and in my training sessions is to make time to think, link, and tinker. So think,
link, and tinker.
And tinker. So the thinking, because before you start to talk with others, you need to be able to talk with yourself. And that goes back to the anthropology of relevance. So one of the difficulties a lot of times in system design is that, you know, you get that flashing screen, it says, what do you want? Okay. And now with Google, you know, it supposedly is, I'm going to use the word intuitive in an ironic way. Because it isn't. It's based on patterns that are within that, and it happens to bring up work that is relevant, in part because if you are at a stage of understanding where you are still trying to language what you know, when you see something that comes at you, you are then responding to it based on where you are starting to go. And there are probably, you know, there could be an exponential number of possible paths you could go on. But whatever you see, if it relates in some way, then drives you down there. It's like coming up to an intersection with 15 different possibilities. And the sign that is the most obvious to you is the one you go towards, not because it's the best, and also probably not because it's the most appropriate, but because at that point in time, you're forced to make a decision.
So you've just blown my mind. It's something I was thinking about as you were talking, and you've taken us on this journey. And I think the pitch students will now know why you've taken us on this journey. Let's get to that question.
Okay.
The question I have is in multiple parts, but let me try and convey what I'm feeling. The first thing I started to feel was, okay, relevance and uncertainty. And then you said using communication and discourse analysis and discourse theory and ways, you know, where you're trained as a library scientist and a librarian to interact with people. They don't, you know, often ask the question that is at the root of their problem. They're skirting around it, trying to figure out what the question is, problem ID. But I wanted to ask you.
Can I just add to that too?
Yes.
That sometimes one reason that people don't ask the question is because They fear asking the question.
Mm-hmm.
And this happens very often
Mm-hmm.
in libraries when someone really wants to ask about, so this happened,
Mm-hmm.
this used to happen to young girls who wanted to ask a question about birth control.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go into a library and to talk to a person, or if your search history is tracked, am I going to ask that?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a whole nother path. So, and that's where the trust building is really important. There's an appreciation that we as individuals don't always initially, when ideas are incubating in our heads, we have what Taylor, who's one of the, I'm laughing because I'd also found accidentally, R.S. Taylor, who's one of the early pioneers in information science, also happened to have worked in intelligence. So because it's black box,
surprise, surprise.
Go figure. And he had this framework that to me has still stood the test of time, where the first hierarchy of need is the pre-articulated need. So it's the sense that before you even can language something,
Mm-hmm.
it is embodied in you. He wouldn't have
Mm-hmm.
used that language, but that is what that is. And so I didn't want to interrupt there, but just to flag that there are a number of ways that can happen. So
I'm glad you interrupted, because I think I had this in my own journey with collaborator and husband MG Michael. We had this innate feeling that things that were external would be internalized. And imagine me going up to my boss at a networking company in 1996 and going, guess what, boss, I'm doing a PhD. Yes, I'm a graduate engineer by day, and I'm going to explore this thing that I think is called chip implants, the black box inside the person. He would have looked at me and said, you're nuts. So I just morphed that into, what did I call it? Multi-application smart card technologies for government agencies or something. So morphed it. That was the pre in me.
Yes.
Until I realized what I was onto with Michael was actually happening. And we were starting to look at biomedical devices and black boxes of those kinds for deep brain stimulation, vagus nerve stimulation, other things. But we had to hide it, because at that point, anyone, what do you mean you're talking about embedding RFID chips in people? You must be crazy. You must be one of these crazy people. Actually, no, we're not, because it's an established science in the medical field and in the other convenience services. But let me ask you now.
And can I say that's also because of that short coding. So that's because we, so Jeff Bowker, I think I said that in the SINS last week, to classify as human. That's how you make sense, because you have to try to navigate the cacophony, both in your own head, but then also around you. And so we short code. The difficulty is sometimes the speed at which we're having to abbreviate who and what we are. Means that you have to think not just about what you want to do, but how what you are going to do and what you say is taken by the person opposite, or the organization opposite. And that goes back to Bloomer and 1930s sociology. So again, just a little jump in, a little segue. See if we can hyperlink.
Is amazing knowledge. Yes.
So your question.
These reference sources, I'm going to encourage all my students to actually go after and look at. They're coming from transdisciplinary areas it's your experience, it's your lived experience. We've spent the semester talking about lived experience and professional expertise, and somewhere they converge. And what we've tried to do today as professions is say, no, at work you do your work stuff, and at home you could be, going through XYZ. It's separate. It's never separate.
Absolutely not.
It's one.
No, I will share with you if you like. So I have a technique in one of my operationalizing chapters where I looked at the phenomenological work of Max von Manen and writing as inquiry. And that's the think, link, and tinker. So you're having the conversation with yourself first and foremost, and making time for those writing stories. And that also goes back to autoethnography. So I'd be delighted to share that if you think that would be useful.
As an approach, I think it would be.
As an approach. So, and I've used that because in my personal life as a carer, I've had to try to write about this. So I'll share that work as well if you think that's helpful, where with another colleague who in another part of the world was experiencing something similar, we morphed a technique I had for autoethnography into collaborative autoethnography to then locate next to, so we had our lives as carers and wives partnering with our lives as scholars in information research. and
Wow.
looking at the way we could extract and legitimate the claims that we were finding. Because so often when you talk about the reason we don't embody this is because you're told, oh, that's not objective, that's not scientific. No,
it's not scientific.
And there is a lot of rigor behind it. So I'd love to share that.
Yes, because then it comes back to what we're talking about. What is evidence, right?
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Like, what's truth, what's real, what's not real, what's
you're
manipulated,
that's
what's
my favorite. Yeah.
Oh, well,
and who's determining what evidence is? Yeah.
Exactly. And we're going to get to that a little bit more in a moment. But what about those systems where, I watch my children research. I know how I was taught to research as a young child by a librarian, by the hand. Here's the Dewey system, here's the catalog, here are the, and then it's got its own shortcomings, of course.
Yeah, absolutely.
All systems do. But when I watch my kids get an assignment, and this is no criticism on my children, this is the whole world at the moment, even adults in universities. What is X and Y together with Z? Let me just type the question in, and if enough people type the question in, they'll get enough people driven with these keywords for these AdWords.
And then everyone knows that X and Y equals purple.
Of course they do, don't they? It's common knowledge. It's on Wikipedia. It's on Wikipedia, Theresa Anderson. It must be right.
Oh, therefore, because everything that matters is in Wikipedia. And no disrespect to Wikipedia, because I think it's an awesome resource. So
yes, me
Web
too.
2.0, Web 3.0. But again, one of the things you learn as a librarian is discernment and evaluation. And in the olden days, when as a child in a school where we didn't have digitization, that discernment it was deliberately slow because everything was in a book. And the way I can remember, I'm older than you, so that may not have existed. But I can remember there used to be this book called the Reader's Index to Periodicals. And it was book. It's one of these codices. So it was an analog version of what you have now at the back end of databases. So what it was on a quarterly basis, and then sometimes you got the loose leaves in between. Libraries would have these publications that would just list. There was an indexing process that went into saying, what topic is covered in what journal. And similarly, the social sciences and the physical sciences citation indices. So I, my secret sauce, and I still tell this to students because there are digital versions that make it easier. But I used to, when I was doing my both masters, I used to find cutting edge material and fast track the search by, when you have a gem. So there are two ways you search: you forward chain and you backward chain. Yes. And a great way to forward chain is when you find a gem that's, say, 10 or 15 years old, when you use a citation index to find out who else is referring to that text.
Yes.
You're fast tracking, but you still need to discern, because someone might be citing that because they're saying this is the worst possible example. So again, it's evidence. So frequency counts don't really
mean anything.
They're primitive. But so again, sorry for interrupting on that.
No, I mean, even in the field of church history or biblical studies and biblical criticism, my husband has shown me, there's one book that I remember well, the Nestle and Allen's, like, it's all about the codices. They've got, scripture at the top, but then you look at the bottom, it's hieroglyphics.
Oh my God, yes.
Like, codex, whatever, codex. And it's in, like, how do you read that? It looks like discrete maths, Michael. Well, it's textual criticism, or it's heavy duty scientific work.
Absolutely.
And people would not know how to read that, right? So in your case, I think because of your skill set in library science, and because you knew what to do with the forward and back, you knew how to go forward. But let's comment again, looking back again, about what's going on today and search engines, and we're covered in data more than ever before, right? What do we do as modern day data scientists or modern day researchers?
Oh,
big question, right?
How many more hours do we have? So on the first, so this is me, the searcher and the disruptor. I would like to see us celebrate uncertainty more. So there are times when uncertainty is problematic. There are experiences of uncertainty, and again, I've written about this a lot.
I need to read your PhDs.
Well, I'll give you the short version. So I'll share. I actually, you'll laugh at this, Katina. Since I was drafting stuff for ISTAS, I have been putting together a Google Doc to share with you and Robbo.
Oh, Dr. Evers will be so happy.
She
will just be ecstatic.
Because I'm trying to work out how do I, because it all started when I was trying to say, how do I describe what I do? Because I see that we have these marvelous overlaps, but also together this extraordinary extension of one another. And I was trying to think, oh, how do I lead you into that? And so then, and also it's been serving as a useful narrative for myself to sort of tell the story of, but it's so ongoing, because every time I start to think, oh, I've got a nice order, and then I say, oh, no, I want to start with this. Oh, and I'll put that. So it will be a work in progress. And that takes me back to von Manen, because one of my favorite quotes, not from Max von Manen, but from the ethnographic narrative writer Jan von Manen, was that analysis is never finished, only over. And that is what I would like to see much more in data spaces. So I ended up, it was the mantra that helped save my sanity with my PhD, because I was like, oh, I'm not done. I'm trying to do, and will you believe? So I followed 2 informants for 2 years, shadowing them to try to understand. I went to the conferences that they spoke at. I read the papers that they wrote. I followed the chain of items I had, and only recently did I get rid of the 4,000 printouts that I had of one search from one of my informants, because he had this really marvelous way of going. And in the thesis itself, because it was becoming far too big, I ended up really only at a minute level looking at 4 different incidents in the deep. So I had both the macro and the micro, because it was just getting, it was this rabbit hole. And so Jan von Manen saved me, because he's like, well, analysis is never finished, only over. And then I drew on education research and narrative inquiry, and that idea of narrative versus story. So what I ended up writing, because the first chapter, and this goes to your point there around evidence, because what the first draft of the first part of the first story on my 2 informants, who were going to be 10, and then my supervisor very sensibly said, I think just 2. That first draft of the first 6 months was over 50,000 words. Okay, first off, no one's going to read 50,000 words. And I didn't write those 50,000 words with a view to someone reading them other than me. But being able to engage in that slow unfolding to move the 50,000 words to 5,000 was powerful as an analytical tool. And that is actually something I've just done a masterclass for some data scientists on this, because it really worries me how so often we talk about getting past the cleaning into the analysis, because that's how the evidence is made. The very decision about what you hold on to, what you order, what you privilege, you are making certain things visible and other things invisible. And so finding ways to tap into your human insight, to your gut, not because it's not professional, but because there is an aspect to you. I still think that the human body is the most extraordinary recording instrument on the planet.
Yes, it is.
And we're just scratching the surface in terms of trying to understand everything that's happening, and that cacophony. So that's the making time to think. And again, not because when I make time to think, I've got all the answers, but I'm going to have more answers than if I didn't think. And then the linking and privileging the linking in the conversations. I so love what you're doing, in this class and every event you've ever run, making time for that linking, because it doesn't sit with the normal practices about an agenda where you're going to have outcomes. And I understand the reason for having that, because again, you have to be able to move forward. But the linking happens, and I have actual evidence for this in the work I did with my informants as well, because the linking at the conferences where I witnessed them. So I was a fly on the wall, just engaging in the conversations they were having. And then I was able to see,
yes,
I have evidence when they went back to search afterwards, the light bulb moments that went off, not because of a formal paper they read or because of something formal they said, possibly part of it, but also because of an accidental encounter where suddenly a word that might have been floating around in their head is now appearing on the screen. So I think the search tools we have now are awesome. I'd much rather have them than not.
yes.
But I think we need to support human thought more. And that goes back to something that Vannevar Bush wrote in 1945 in my, one of my absolute favorite essays about this, As We May Think, where he talks about his aspirations. So I'm not sure if that's a name that is familiar to your students in terms of
Vannevar Bush.
Vannevar Bush.
Yes. Would you believe in our School for the Future of Innovation in Society was the great Pascal Greg Zachary, who wrote The Last Frontier, The Final Frontier.
Okay. Excellent. Okay.
So we've been blessed with
brilliant,
with deep researchers who love him.
That and it's just in. When I read and reread those passages, I read it with the eye of someone whose family went through that cataclysm in the 40s. I read how in 1945, trying to imagine making a better world when you're at the dawn of the nuclear age. That's as much about humans as it is about computational possibilities. And I take that spirit and again, I'm not saying that's a singular reading of it. That's the reading of his work that has constantly come back to me in my heart as I move forward. And I think again, that time to think, link, and tinker is where I have decided that the path that I need to take is one where I do story that more and I slow down and but I also try to find a way to keep morphing. I love, I love that idea of thinking about the morphing and the shape shifting and turning that into not something that happens incidentally, but something that is deliberately privileged.
I appreciate that so much. We had Jumana Bugazale from Pivot for Humanity, and we also had Mark Hurst on the program for our pitch students. And both of them said something very much linked to you, which is why I think this community is forming, is that it's not about moving fast and breaking things. That's a ridiculous kind of model to work in. In fact, co-design and participatory design requires deliberation and time. It requires consultation and engagement. And it's not, as Mark Hurst says in his book, Customer Included from 2013, we both concur, the user is not somewhere over there at arm's length. Just stay over there. I'll just do what you need me to do, and I'll fix it for you. Just keep out of my way. Keep out of my way.
Tell me what I want you to tell me.
Yeah.
So that I can do what I was going to do anyway.
And pay lip service.
That's right.
And a lot of the public interest technology graduate students are very experienced employees. Maybe the group is about a quarter coming through just post an undergraduate degree with several years of employment experience, and the other half are more mature with between 10 and 20 years of experience. But for the older group, they've made a decision. They don't want to keep going the way they are going, and they want to expand their horizons. They don't want to be siloed. They don't want to be straitjacketed. They're almost coming to the same realization you came at as a youthful individual in your 20s, early 20s, because of those initial interactions. Call them fate, call them you were just attuned to what people were saying and you were listening. You would call it discernment. You sort of knew your life was going to be quite transdisciplinary as you went about it. And I think you were at peace with the lived experience side and the professional expertise, whereas some of the engineers, and I was one of those people, felt like, well, we're not, what do you mean you're going to use you're going to do something at work that might express your true opinion? No, you don't.
Yeah.
You've got the minute you go into the boardroom with the texter, the clean whiteboard, and you've got the you better be careful how you write that. And what is it? Should that be a triangle representation of a mobile switching center? And anyone else, you concur that it should be a triangle? Okay, I'll do a triangle.
And we never use all caps, no,
of course not.
Yeah, it's like, oh, golly.
Or exclamation marks, because maybe you're always excitable. I don't know.
You remind me of, so when I started the data science and innovation postgrad, and that was very deliberately transdisciplinary. And when I say I started, it wasn't me.
No.
It was a team.
But hang on. Let's go back to that, because I reckon you were probably the first person in Australia to do that.
It was the first degree of its kind. Yeah. And it was.
What year was that?
So we took our first students. We started launching in 2014, and we took our first students in 2015. And it had been cooking, circulating. The idea had been circulating around UTS for about 5-6 years, not with me at the helm. Mm-hmm. So because this is very much of its time, and UTS had a number of people like me who were intellectual refugees, sort of floating around and crossing boundaries, but hitting the issues of structure and accountabilities and ways that universities operate. And as it happened, so and I was reflecting on this a little while later, the woman that ended up being given the brief to start writing up some of this was one of my first students. No.
Of course she was.
Of course. So, because she was at that point moving already into a position of leadership in the university, and ironically, when I don't think she'll mind me saying this, because you won't be able to put 2 and 2 together over in ASU, but she started this project as part of a master's project in the program that I left, which was the information masters.
Yes.
And I left because they were too boxy.
Yes.
And I'm laughing because we laughed about it later on when the two of us were working on the program. So she became the center director, and I was she got a bare pass on one part of that project because her supervisor said, "Oh, this is so unrealistic." She was like, we sat back with our first cohort and we went,
laughed.
Yeah,
so
really
unrealistic is happening.
But so in 2014, so early 2014, the working document that she had started to write was open for consultation with people like me across the university who were in, not that everyone languaged it as socio-technical, but they weren't just in one domain. So there was a recognition that data science and that what was really the motivation was the realization that there was a new kind of professional that was needed in industries that were working with data technologies. You needed to have someone who wasn't just good at statistics or just good at math or just good at business analysis. You needed someone who could cut across those and who understood complexity and knew how to work with that. And so this broad structure document was created, and then they deliberately asked people who cut across different kinds of boundaries across the university to give advice on it. And I was so excited when I got asked, and I found out afterwards she very deliberately asked me, and I was one of the last ones because she knew I was going to be the biggest disruptor.
Yes.
So, and I'm happy to oblige. So I look at this document, and it's very technical. It's very very clear on the kinds of technical skills they want to give these students. But what I saw missing was the socio-technical. What I saw missing was the concern around the politics of infrastructure and the issues around evidence and what constitutes evidence and who's naming that evidence and how do you develop the skill set that you need in the profession to do that. Now, at this point, because I thought I was going to be leaving university because the subject I used to teach on social informatics and the socio-technical had just been discontinued.
Yeah, as they do. In Wollongong University and many others. Yes.
Yeah. So and the transdisciplinary faculties program. So they had just started to develop a program at the undergraduate level that taught the way that I used to teach in social informatics. So I was on that team. So that was one program. So that covered some of my teaching. And you know, when you're an academic and they're trying to do the percentages of what your teaching and your research was, I was really struggling. And so I was about to go back into industry and do work on equity and diversity. And I thought, oh, okay, I've been asked to inform on this. You know, I'm going to be speaking to the advisory board and giving feedback. If I can say enough to get one subject in that new program, then I'd have that subject, and I'd have the new undergraduate subject, I'd have some teaching, and you know, that'll be okay. Well, you kind of know, and you probably your students have, I hope they've had experiences like this, you know, when you're speaking to a group or even just another person, and you know the minute you're starting to talk and they're frantically writing down everything that you say, that you're on to something.
That's been this session.
Yeah.
And what the students don't realize or don't know is that I believe, and I could be wrong, but you taught one of their other guest lecturers, Matthew Midcar, which is an incredible thing when we think about what's happened in the last, I guess, since October-ish last year, where we sort of collided on LinkedIn. All of us didn't know one another, but there's you, there's Jemana Bugazella, there's Matt Midcar, Nathan Kinch, Robert Abbas, Nicole Stevenson. You know, this list goes on, but we've somehow gone crunch. And I just met international.
Yeah, it's and I was so delighted to find that I'm talking with you, thinking you're at ASU, and you are, but you're also physically in Australia. So that was kind of cool. And I just encountered someone who knows you from a past life, who's now the manager of the New South Wales ACS branch, who I'm working with because I'm the incoming vice chair for New South Wales. And he said, I saw, because you're part of my Women in Data Science panel, he goes, you've got an impressive group of women there. I saw Katina Michael. I mean, I was like, yes.
It's generous.
The whole world's come together.
And I thought you were at the University of Illinois.
I know.
So I'm just like, I've left America. Oh no, I have to meet this person. You're here. What?
And it shows you about the short coding, because LinkedIn is it's wonderful, but then also, as hard as I try to say I'm in Sydney, I'm at Illinois, and I'm doing some work now in terms of prepping some training on trust building for New South Wales government. And there was a question that came from someone in government. They said, we can't have someone from America doing this, and the chief data scientist had to say, she's in Sydney. It's like labels, but So I obviously, so the fast track to that story is, not only did I say enough to help get one subject, they realized that they had to go back to the drawing board and basically rework the framing of what would be the new data science and innovation program. And then I had the great honor to be able to bring it to life. And again, as an uncertainty researcher and as someone who has been transdisciplinary, as someone who recognized, I felt that what I needed to do in these data scientists, because a lot of them come from, that's what reminded me of your story, a lot of our catchment in the early years in particular were coming from software engineering jobs, or from actuary jobs, very analytical, not the kind of place where they're used to inventiveness, storytelling, or anything that deals with affect. And uncertainty is, when there is uncertainty, the sooner you get through it, the better. So, and I'm just smiling because I still remember one of the first induction classes, because I also recognize you need to allow for the slow unfolding. You don't just hit someone like that over the head with this new way of being. You have to find a way in for them.
Yes.
And to go gently. And the first induction night, when I had them drawing, and I'm gonna send it to you, because when you were talking about journeys, I do this little exercise that we were doing in the graduate program. They may not be doing it anymore, where the poem about the journey to Ithaca is played, and then we're trying to get them to think about mapping and the different ways that maps represent. And so I pulled out this map that had, and the job that everyone had at the induction was to create a representation of their choosing, using this very broad framework to tell the story of how they got to where they are right now. So if Ithaca is the new degree, the Master of Data Science and Innovation, what have you done? And I did my own. And you can just picture a room of engineers and financial operators with Post-its, crayons. They each had a map. They could pick the color that they wanted, and they had these big collaborative tables. And then they were just frozen. It was like, what? So then the one of them who was in banking, he said, "Oh, this is giving me permission to do the sorts of things that I see my kindergarten kids do. My children at home are doing this."
Yes.
And I said, yeah, just tap into that. And there's, no judgment, no one. And then you also create that safe space where I say, I want you to draw this for yourself. No one is going to be obliged to show this. At the end of that process, I'm going to ask for some invitations to come forward. And then that example then helps others, and it inspired, and that's the beauty of co-design too, is to put enough structure there so that you have a starting point, but to also make sure that you are not so driven by that structure that you don't allow. And that's a really hard thing to do if you haven't experienced it yourself. So again, it was really critical to me as part of the training of these data scientists to not talk the talk, but to walk the walk, and to give them the tools for that. And one of the most magical examples from that first day, that first evening, and he's a graduate that I still have contact with, and I it's one of those proud teacher moments. Frozen, total. He was a very senior engineer in his organization, and he was terrified to start drawing, because that sense of, what's the method? What am I supposed to do? What's the protocol? He saw some of the examples. He really needed more time because it was such a new way of working. And then he suddenly tapped into a part of his past when he worked with isobars and meteorology. Yes. And suddenly his map became different isobaric measures of the aspects of his life that came together in high pressure and low. It was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And then he was so excited he wanted to share it. And then, he started blogging, and he started communicating his uncertainties, and it just it does work, but it doesn't work by saying, here's the formula and this is what you do. It's about creating the safe space to experience uncertainty, and to also start to tap into your own understandings about just how much uncertainty you can take. And that then in the process builds up the empathic appreciation that you need, so that when you are then in a position of power and you're working with data or you're working with technology, and you can't always be the other, you at least can remember some of those experiences of otherness. And that seems a really important way to be human.
Just when you said the word magical, I was thinking of how I would describe this interview. It is magical. You're magical. And I'll tell you something. I don't think I've come across someone like you. I know Dr. Abbas thinks the same, and the rest of the group that's been sort of mobilizing thinks this much, especially the group that was at ISTES, including Professor Eusebio Skornavaca. What you did at ISTES with Nicole Stevenson was quite magical, bringing us together into a mindful state. And that creation of the safe space is not everyone's, how can I say, skill set. I think it's very rare. And I feel safe in your presence. I feel I can express myself the way I want to. And there's something about you, Theresa Anderson, I can't really describe in words, but I think the students listening to this interview understand. But you're able, I think because of your practitioner background, sure, you went to university and then you went straight into practice in this complex space that required so much of your attention from a variety of directions. And then you've come, almost full circle back to this, let's look at autoethnography, and let's look at it as a valid tool. Let's not only look at what is evidence, but scientific evidence, qualitative evidence, subjectiveness and objectiveness and imperatives and beliefs and culture and knowledge of different kinds of theoretical approaches. In the guts of it, when you're talking about journey maps, we showed one of them most recently looking at the journey map for homelessness, and was it a new service, an existing service, or responding to a specific service, and then you'd have different journey maps according to this. But you're talking about personal journey maps, not just system-wise journey maps, and sort of interrelating all of these bits and pieces. And even Professor Jeremy Pitt and Dr. Abbas are trying to figure out, well, okay, socio-technical theory, design, and what kind of design, what kind of approach, and how do you look at this in a holistic view? Well, I think you've got the answer in this empathic approach that you have just by nature. It's you in your guts and in your bones. And I think the public interest tech students, similarly, once they see a model they can adopt, because they have parts of this in them already, I see it in them. We hold conversations. They said this whole course, Katina, should have been just one big, long conversation, because I said to them, here's a 50-day challenge. We're going to meet every day but Friday. And we're going to just talk, and who cares about the 1 hour structure? We might go to 1.5 or 2 hours like we did today. But that's you. And in the last 2-3 minutes, I'm going to let you have the last word. I have to move on, unfortunately, to another call. But how would you summate, having heard what I've just presented to you? But that's you in your guts. And now, no surprise, you've gone back into practice. You'll always be a researcher, right? To the end of time. But you've gone back into practice.
So I'm a scholarly practitioner, I think, is what I've realized, is I don't need a university to do what I do. And I may be empowered to actually help make the change that I would like to see. I do want to say, Katina, your description of me so empowers me and emboldens me. And if I am magical in our conversations, it's as much about you as it is about me. And I think I see you as having this amazing capacity to put people at ease. So I have not, from the very first moment you reached out and you replied to a post that I put in LinkedIn, and your tagline, just trying to about being better humans, and so that is really what I think I would like to see make possible everywhere. Is we're talking about allowing everyone to find a way to be their best self, whatever that is, to find ways to be able to tap into their felt sense, so that they're listening to all the signals that are coming to them from the experiences that they have. So when I did that journey exercise myself, and that clarified for me how what was seeming like all these disparate, discontinuous paths that were making me look like I was not an academic, actually all led to that very moment. And I don't think that's accidental, but I think that's as much a consequence of the fact that I'm not strategic. I'm bohemian. I go with my heart. I can't fight it. It's important to me to have joy, but life is such that I can't have joy all the time. But I don't play games. I design games. Let's say it. But I don't like to play games with people. I'll play games. I create games. I've created a whole universe that I've told you. I want to introduce your students to this planetary system where they're going to play with what constitutes evidence and the naming conventions that then shape how someone would see a new world. But gaming someone and is just showing disrespect. And I think I really do thank my parents for that, because of the experiences that they had and the gentleness that they had in their lives, even though they experienced such trauma as children. I mean, my father was left for dead 3 times before he was 18. By all accounts, he should.
Goosebumps.
And having lost them both in 2018 really was the crystallizing moment for me, because that was the point where I thought, okay, my mark on earth is a consequence of what they have given me, and they come from a global, from a time in the 20th century that had such ugliness and such trauma. It's not the only experience like that. But in my family history, that has been an important thing to turn into something good. And as you do when you reflect on loss and becoming a double orphan, I just felt I needed to privilege that aspect much more. And as fortune would have it, suddenly realizing, okay, I can be courageous like that and speak this way in a domain where you don't often speak that way.
Yes.
And for whatever reason, it's resonating. And that then just further empowers me, which is beautiful. I mean, to be surrounded by people like you, and I also feel really fortunate to be sitting in New South Wales and being in contact with people who also want to make change, and then
Yes.
globally, people who want to make change, and saying, okay, there's a lot of ugliness in the world. There's a lot that is beyond my control. But if you just look for what you can do, so that, and you and I have spoken before about this, I love this Indigenous notion of just moving forward. So the mantra of respect, engagement, moving forward is the modus operandi, that the heuristic that I like to remind myself of every day. So how do I show respect for those around me? How do I show respect for the planet that I inhabit? And I'm not perfect. None of us are, but the sense of respect is not saying you have to be perfect. But it reminds you to respect, to recognize the consequences of your actions for others. Engagement is that co-design. It's just being in that space, and if you're showing respect for others, then in that engagement process, when you hit a road bump, when something goes quite right, if you have that, if you have mutual respect, you have the kind of trust that is going to allow you to deal with the mistakes and the errors and the course corrections, and then that moves you forward. And we can't ask for better. I just think it, maybe I'm I won't say hopeless optimist, but I'm much more a glass half full than a half empty.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be a preservation technique, but it has not been a bad way to go. And I feel very privileged to have had opportunities to meet amazing people like you and the community you're growing. And I feel connected to your students, even though I don't see them. And I've already fortunately met a few through
Yes.
engagement. And yeah,
mm-hmm.
It's like analysis, this conversation is not finished, only over.
Exactly. Let's hold on to that thought. And I'm going to say thank you before signing off, on behalf of all the students, for having given of your time freely many times over now. I think it's been at least 3 formal engagements. And this sharing capacity that you have is something that is so appreciated, because in many ways you're opening up our students to mechanisms by which they feel at peace with themselves. And there's nothing greater than being at peace with yourself. So Theresa Anderson, thank you so much. Dr. Theresa Anderson, with all your journeying and all your armor of goodness. Till next time.
Thank you, Katina, for this opportunity. And hello, everyone. When you're in Sydney, drop by.
Much love.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.